My name is Jonathan McGaha, and I hope you find this as interesting as I did researching it. So what does debt mean, and when did it start? Graeber coined this in his book, Debt, the First 5,000 Years, in which he researches the subject of the origin of debt pretty thoroughly. Coins, being metal, preserve better in the archaeological record than written records do. However, tablets found in ancient Sumerian dig sites record complex debt and credit ledgers. Debt and currency have existed simultaneously for thousands of years, and according to Graeber's research, debt has actually preceded hard currency. Debt was social capital and is as old as human civilization itself, but its meaning has changed quite broadly over time. And how has that meaning changed? Continue. Money itself is considered a form of debt. Franco-German scholars interpret money as tokens of one's debt to society, while Anglo-American scholars interpret it the opposite direction, society's debt to individuals. Debt has meant many things over time. For individuals, debt has been a personal obligation, a fundamental reality of existence, a sin, a burden, and an investment. By the 18th century, credit was considered nearly criminal, and cash intrinsically moral. In modern times, the perception of debt has become an interesting amalgamation of many prior discrete perceptions. Debt is now viewed again as a fundamental reality of existence, but also as access to forms of lifestyle people are told they should have. Consumptive debt, like going into debt for a vacation or a PlayStation or an extravagance of some sort, is now not considered a sinful vice. However, it does receive a similar conception based on how much debt an individual has accrued. Consumers display all signs of still wanting to be debt-free and maintain an aversion to credit card default, but consumptive debt is normalized in modern society, while it simultaneously causes extreme stress and discomfort. In the past, this was managed by societies having regular periods of debt forgiveness, which protected debtors, and by so doing protected the society on which those debtors and creditors depended. But as the modern world is built more and more on a system of credit and debt, old religious rules which used to govern society from Abrahamic religions at least against extreme usury have been replaced by state laws. This legalization of usury has had the side-on effect to criminalize debt. National debt's perception is, as ever, more complicated than that of individuals. It can be an indicator of moral richness and power, but it can also be an indicator of decline. This Graeber quote is a great example of why debt forgiveness mattered so much in the past, and probably still will in the future. When people are in mass amounts of debt, they have a tendency to abandon society, and it can cause the collapse of civilization. I've organized the wellness impacts of debt in 3 categories: personal, national, and hybrid. Personal will focus on personal lives. National will obviously be sovereign debt, and hybrid will be how the two affect each other. Debt grants an individual access to aspects of modern life they would otherwise not have. The existence of federal interventions in the mortgage market has enabled otherwise absurd loans, like a 30-year fixed-interest mortgage, which enables the modern individual to own a home. However, economies built around easy access to credit have downsides for individuals as well. Finance institutions have achieved a powerful level of governance over populations via debt, and debt's growing necessity in the 20th and 21st centuries have created a pipeline of worker income into finance profits. Securitized loans enables the repayment of debt to span across lifetimes, further empowering the finance industry. In 1946, 8,600 Americans declared bankruptcy. In 2005, 2 million did. So in 1946, that was a ratio of 1 in 17,000. In 2005, that was a ratio of 1 in 150. The combination of debt-related shame with a highly individualized culture has resulted in the number of Americans reporting that they had no one in whom they could confide tripling between 1885 and 2004. In 2000, 25% of American households were made up by one person. So the building of a society around lending has enabled more isolation than ever before. Another aspect of marketing having done away with the difference between consumptive and productive debt until it becomes embarrassing has been a rise in consumption of energy and resources. The United States, with 5% of the world population, consumes 25% of its energy. Due to the complexities of international politics, it is not a simple equation of high debt equals national decline. High levels of indebtedness also characterize states on the rise. While world power and influence have historically accrued to creditor countries, it must be noted that the U.S. as a debtor nation has great power over creditors in that currency depreciation in the U.S. reduces U.S. importing of creditor country goods. Debtor nations can defend their autonomy by borrowing diversely and by being large enough that the debt termination poses a significant risk to the international finance system. The U.S., for the time being at any rate, effectively is too big to fail, to borrow a term from 2008. U.S. budget deficit hasn't as a percentage been much higher than other countries by the year 1991. However, it must be noted in the last 30 years that the U.S. has accumulated historic levels of debt, both public and private. By 2006, public debt was $9 trillion, which is 70% of the GDP. Personal bankruptcy in 2007 increased 40% over 2006. And in 2009, public debt stood at $14 trillion, and the Wall Street bailout reached $19 trillion. So one must be cognizant of the ever-changing relationship between debt and society over time when one assesses the risks of sovereign debt. As 2008 should have taught us all, too big to fail is only true until it isn't. In the last decade, U.S. sovereign debt has skyrocketed. When Milner was writing her assessment of U.S. debt in 1993, foreign investors only held $700 billion in U.S. debt. However, that sovereign debt has gone up to $3,600 billion by 2011, when Graeber wrote his more dire assessment. So Milner was accurate in 1993 when she said that foreign capital held little influence over U.S. policy, but that ratio has changed. The impacts and consequences of debt on individual lives are different pre-Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment. They are different pre-industrial revolution and post. How society reacts to debt and how society organizes itself in relation to debt defines debt's power over society. A society organized around production has a powerful incentive to manage and contextualize debt in terms of productive versus consumptive activity. Societies organized around the finance industry, as modern societies now are experiencing a pernicious incentive to dismiss the ideological and fiscal separation between types of debt. In terms of who controls the state, the people, or the debt industry, the power dynamic is also shifting. Finance interests are increasingly interested in purchasing U.S. debt, growing the finance industry's power over policy. Since the 1970s, the fastest growing industry in the United States has been the finance industry, and like that of foreign powers via direct foreign investments influence, the private finance industry's sway over the state is also growing, as one can see in this chart. Private finance has no party loyalty or restraint. While some Americans operate under the assumption that conservative politicians are subject to this industry, the fact of the matter is that American politics, and as a consequence domestic policy, are suffused with the power of the debt industry. As we all know, Goldman Sachs CDOs bundled together bad investments and sold them. Goldman Sachs also contributed $1 million to the Obama campaign. Goldman Sachs' former CEO Henry Paulson was George W. Bush's Treasury Secretary. Robert Rudin, who was at Goldman Sachs for 26 years, was Bill Clinton's Treasury Secretary. Goldman Sachs evaporated $5 trillion from the NASDAQ with their CDOs by shifting the burden of bad loans to pensions and city investment portfolios during the collapse of 2008. In recompense to society, Goldman Sachs paid all of 1% effective tax in 2008. The debt industry's power over American domestic and foreign policy is a constant, regardless of party power. The growth of national and private buying of U.S. debt introduces more competition for control over policy between citizens and financiers. Budget deficits also cause the appreciation of currency and a loss of international competitiveness. This means manufacturing declines. A decline in manufacturing accompanies a decline in labor power, which results in stagnant wages. Real wages in the United States have been stagnant since the 1970s, while worker productivity has risen steadily, creating a gap between value added by labor and the value paid to labor. On the bright side, this stagnation of wages has led to more women entering the workplace, which has granted women more power over their own lives by having their own access to money and debt. Since 2007, industrialized capitalist nations have socialized the burden of private and unsustainable enterprises, driving a rise in austerity. The socialization of risk and the subsequent austerity politics of it can drive societal problems. While historic examples of societies dealing with debt focused on protecting the debtor to preserve stability, modern nations focus on protecting creditors, increasing instability. The reality of this is surely not lost on all creditors, as creditors have a vested investment in the strength of the currency of their debtors. One of the rare times when bankers suffer is when confidence ebbs. It is because of this interdependence between creditors and debtors that stability has been maintained in the past through reasonable mutual sacrifice. Thanks for bearing with me through all this. I know it's a complicated topic and kind of a bummer. If I can say anything has influenced me from this study of wellness, especially in the context of this subject, it's the vital importance of empathy for your fellow man and your fellow worker. In a world in which the power of the citizen is assuredly declining and being edged out, it's perhaps more important than ever to shed simplified morality condemnations and class discrimination against those suffering under debt, or suffering in general. The kings of Babylon knew that the people had power when they worked together, and I believe the finance industry can also learn. But we can't teach them if we're clawing each other down. Our wellness is directly dependent on our capacity for compassion. As we maintain a consciousness of our own wellness and that of others on a day-to-day basis, we can see instinctively that a careful and compassionate assessment of events is important. Those of us who work for a living have quite similar problems when it comes to the 8 dimensions of wellness, so we should all try and work together. We all live in societies which are funded and based on debt, and our aspiration of fulfilling our 8 dimensions of wellness are influenced by that, regardless of how we live individually. If some of us have maintained a stronger understanding of the difference between productive and consumptive debt than others, we should try and teach one another rather than condemning. The power of marketing over how we perceive our wellness in these 8 dimensions is strong, and perhaps few of us have had the upbringing or leisure time necessary to assess them with a clear mind. So it's important to stay friendly and communal as we try and fulfill our dimensions of wellness and see each other doing it differently. Just looking at the 8 dimensions of wellness shorthand illustration reminds one of how complex individual and societal health must be, as so many dimensions are involved in wellness, and as we've reviewed in this presentation, how interconnected even just finance is with so many of those dimensions.